Welcome everybody, and thanks for listening to our presentation, Torres Strait Islander History, Sport, Culture and Identity. We've been working with Indigenous communities about their sporting past for the last decade. The key principles we work with are being respectful, listening to and collaborating with our Indigenous communities, being responsible, responding to the needs of the communities, and being reciprocal, giving back to these communities. Two examples of our projects are on the left, Harry Moseby, the first and only Torres Strait Islander Paralympian, and our second project, Marching with the Mission, which is a history of Cherbourg marching girls, which was recently published. This is the most famous Torres Strait Islander athlete, Paddy Mills. He plays in the NBA, originally for the Spurs, now for Brooklyn. He was also the Australian captain of the Olympic team at the recent Olympic Games. You may know very little about the Torres Strait Islands, but the Torres Strait Islands exist between Papua New Guinea in the north and Cape York, which is the tip of Australia, in the south. This research, at its heart, addresses identity and Indigenous Australians. As we all understand, identity is fragmented, complex, and changing. Many of our identities are shaped by a multitude of factors, including class, race, gender, sexuality, religion, and education. For Indigenous Australians, however, identity is even more complex and is shaped by additional factors, which may include ethnicity, cultural identity, tribal identity, acculturation, enculturation, bicultural identity, multicultural identity, and of course, the way in which other forms of identity have been shaped by settler colonial narratives. In an Australian context, one of the key issues is the differences between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander identities. Torres Strait Islanders share with Aborigines the status of Indigenous minority in the Australian nation state. Torres Strait Islanders are officially recognised as a distinct Indigenous people in Australia. However, they are considerably outnumbered by Aboriginal Australians, and their identity is often subsumed or ignored under the term Aboriginal. This is in the context of that their history and their cultures are significantly different to Aboriginal Australians. So this project focuses on using sport history to actually demonstrate the complexity and uniqueness of Torres Strait Islander culture, history, and identities. It helps demonstrate the difference between Torres Strait Islanders and Aboriginal people from the mainland. And in the end, it will help to assert the independence of Torres Strait Islanders in settler colonial Australia.
This map helps illustrate the complexities of identity that exist within the Torres Strait. So that Murray was just referring to. So this particular map shows the same islands that we just looked at, but it shows the various groupings of islands. There are 5 separate island groupings that reflect various linguistic, cultural, and other significant identity differences. So to help us unpack Torres Strait Islander identity in all its richness, we're going to employ island studies and the archipelagic turn that's characterized island studies more recently. What island studies does, it stresses that islands matter, that islands are not just insignificant entities, but islands, especially groups of islands in their interconnectivity, are significant points of understanding, especially of culture and identity. The archipelagic turn within island studies theorizes this island cultural connectivity and the collective identities that exist, And it conceives of archipelagos or chains of islands, not as isolated spaces, but as bridged spaces worthy of our study. And this emphasis on the connectedness of place, space, mobilities, and performance makes the archipelagic turn useful for considering sport. So in our project, what we propose is to examine 4 separate aspects of sport within the Torres Strait Archipelago. The first is sport as it's played on the individual islands and all of the various cultural, Western, traditional influences at play there. We're also going to consider sporting connections between the islands and sporting activities between the islands and the regional neighbors to the north and south, and also the various national and international sporting contexts that exist. So first, sport on the islands, and what's important to consider here is that there's a wide range of both traditional sports and Western sports in the pre and the post-colonial eras. And here we have an illustration, a photograph from the 1930s of what was known as a tennis dance. Dance is a very important cultural tradition in the Torres Strait, and dancers draw in their choreography on various cultural influences, and there's been a number of sport-themed dances. And here we have a tennis dance, which illustrates really neatly the complex ways that sport and culture are intertwined and the ways that various external cultures can be appropriated. Here we have another example of a traditional sporting activities that fuses both traditional and modern. This is a photo from 1914 showing Islander men dressed in traditional garb, sailing model pearling luggers or pearling vessels. And pearling was a very important economic mainstay from the 1870s onwards. And this is a really classic, really interesting example of how islanders have incorporated traditional aquatic practices with the arrival of boats, which they've miniaturized and turned into competition. There's a huge range of modern Western sports that were picked up with great enthusiasm on the islands. Here we have a group of women on the island of Nagar depicted. They're a basketball team. This is in the pre-World War II era. Sport in the islands, as elsewhere, is heavily dominated by men, but there is a lot of evidence in the islands of women's sporting activities, and importantly, the importance of those sporting activities to the women. In this photo from 1932, we have teams of men soccer players. Soccer was never a huge sport in the Strait, nor was it the biggest of all of the football codes in Australia itself, but it illustrates the ebbs and flows of sporting influences on the islands. And in this period, at least, this was a very important sport for these men. We also want to consider sporting activities between the islands, and perhaps the best example of this is the Island of Origin competition in rugby league that began in the late 1980s and has continued pretty much ever since. This is a really important event in the islands where teams form based on ancestral islands. So no matter where a player currently lives or for whom they might play, they play for their island of origin. This mimics a major rugby league competition that occurs in mainland Australia each year, but it's a really important focus and channel for cultural pride. We also need to consider sporting links with regional neighbors, in particular, sporting activities between the Torres Strait and Papua New Guinea to the north and Cape York and beyond in Australia. From the 1960s to the 1980s, school students did an annual sporting exchange with Daru in Papua New Guinea. And this is a collection of images from those sporting activities. These are long-standing links beyond sport, but sport has been an important channel for these links as well. And finally, we need to consider Torres Strait Islander sport in the national and international contexts, keeping in mind the diaspora of islanders. So most islanders today don't live in the Torres Strait on the islands themselves, but are spread throughout Australia. And when an islander athlete plays, and we've got Paddy Mills here playing for Australia at Tokyo last year, when an islander like Mills plays on the international or national stage, they become a rich source of cultural pride and Torres Strait Islander identity. In the middle here, we have Delma Gisu, who was the first Australian rules women's football player. And there are various organizations that exist within the Torres Strait, such as the Torres Strait Youth and Recreational Sporting Association, that foster and provide sporting opportunities for islanders throughout Australia and beyond.
In this project, we will use the resources afforded by digital technologies. We will use digital platforms that will enable us to get communities involved in these projects, to make contributions to these projects. We will use digital platforms to help repatriate resources. Archival material that we find will be transported back to the Torres Strait Islander communities for their use and appreciation. And will we use the digital platforms as the basis of our geospatial information systems programs. What we will use GIS to achieve is to map the participation at local, national, and international level. What is essentially a far-flung community. The majority of the Torres Strait Islander communities actually live in mainland Australia outside the Torres Strait. In many ways, Torres Strait Islander sport is very similar to mainland sport. That is, they play sports like basketball, rugby league, and soccer. But it is the appropriation of these sports which is indicative and expresses Torres Strait Islander culture and identity. This image depicts the unique forms of dancing that is associated often with sport in the Torres Strait. In conclusion, we argue that sport offers a powerful lens for understanding Australian Indigenous cultures, histories, and identities. It was one form of cultural activities that was promoted, sanctioned, and encouraged by settler colonial regimes in Queensland. It enables us to actually identify the distinctive Torres Strait Islander cultures, to make these cultures more visible. And it helps us disentangle Torres Strait Islander cultures and experiences from those of Aboriginal peoples. These are the sources that we've used to develop our presentation and our project. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.